In this video, we're going to see a way to model kind of exceptions to a process. So not in part of the normal flow, but rather how we can deal with things that we get, triggers that we get from outside. So think of messages, think of errors, think of signals, think of any other thing that comes from outside and influences our process. We can model the way to handle these triggers using event subprocesses. And they provide a very clean and neat way to do that if you do not require anything outside of the current subprocess. Let's see how they work. When we want to start a standard subprocess, we must use an empty start event. Because a subprocess always starts when it gets a token, that means that whenever you are in the subprocess, you can only start with an empty start event, because the other triggers, we already know it was a token, so there's no point in using a message. If we want to have a subprocess that starts based on a trigger, we cannot use a normal subprocess, but we have to use a so-called event subprocess. And without further ado, this is what they look like. Notice that it looks exactly like a subprocess, however the border is dotted and the start event is a trigger. So we put this thing into another process or subprocess, and that means that during the entirety of that subprocess or process, so from start to end when it's running, whenever this trigger happens, we will execute this event subprocess. This event subprocess is interrupting, which means that it removes all the tokens from its parent process when this trigger arrives, so it stops the parent process. If we collapse it, it looks like this. So again, a collapsed subprocess with the little plus in the bottom, and what is special is that we put the trigger in the top left corner. This thing also comes in non-interrupting variants. So in a non-interrupting event subprocess, we do not remove the tokens from the parent process that this event subprocess is in. We indicate this using the dash, and this indicates that this event subprocess is non-interrupting. We also have a collapsed version of this for readability purposes, and that looks the same as a normal subprocess with the little plus in the bottom, and on the top left, again, a trigger with a dashed border. So let's look a bit more in detail. This thing needs to live in a process or a subprocess. So as I already mentioned, during the entirety of that process or subprocess, whenever the trigger happens, this event subprocess will be executed. It is not a part of the normal token flow. So where a normal subprocess or task or any other activity must have an incoming and an outgoing sequence flow, an event subprocess cannot have that. So no sequence flows are coming in or out of an event subprocess. It's purely to handle that trigger and then move on. If it's interrupting, then it removes all the tokens from the parent process or subprocess where it is in, but only if it is interrupting. If it's non-interrupting, it has no influence on the parent process at all. So that parent process just keeps running. It doesn't even notice. These things work in parallel. However, you're still within the scope of that parent process, so you can use its data. Let's look at an example. Here we have a small process consisting of several steps in order to handle a purchase order. The start of this purchase order handling process is a message start event, quite standard. Then we register the purchase order, and then we move into the handle PO subprocess where several things can happen. The default flow is shown now, and which is check availability. If it's available, then send the PO response. If not, then throw an error. Now this error needs to be handled, otherwise it just propagates up, and that might give unwanted effects higher up the hierarchy. So what we need to do here is first of all handle that error, and second, let's say that during this process, so during this handle purchase order, the customer might come back and say, oh, I have a change of address. Let's model that. For an address change, we use an event subprocess that is non-interrupting, because the address change has no influence on the steps we are performing during this handle PO subprocess. So we add in this non-interrupting event subprocess based on a message. So whenever the customer sends us an address change message, then we will completely in parallel to the main flow execute this event subprocess and simply change the address, which is this subprocess. That's what we execute then. Then we need to handle the exception. If this exception is thrown, we want to send a message. So we add another event subprocess that is triggered by this error, and in this subprocess we then send a message to the customer that the items are not available. Now notice that this keeps this process kind of clean. You see there, these event subprocesses are not part of the normal flow, so there is no sequence flows going in and out. So the parent of this handle PO subprocess doesn't have anything to do with these event subprocesses. And that is kind of a nice distinction between who does what. This wraps up the event subprocesses. Event subprocesses can be used to handle triggers that arrive during a process or a subprocess, and then there is a choice between either stopping the parent process immediately or keep executing it and do something next to that. It can be used to divide the task between parent and child process, because we can keep this event subprocess within the child. So the parent doesn't need anything to deal with errors. It's just the inner process takes care of it. And that might be a good way to model such type of responses to triggers.